Esther, do not imagine that you alone will somehow escape with your life out of all the Jews, just because you're in the king's house, Mordecai told Queen Esther in his message. If you remain silent now, help and deliverance will come from elsewhere for our people, but you and your family will surely perish, the message continued. Who knows if it wasn't for such a time as this that you've become queen? Children, welcome to the third episode of Esther's life. Last time we witnessed how the Lord raised Esther to a high position and made her queen. Her coronation was a joyful occasion, but not long after, a great threat fell upon Esther and all of her people. Because Mordecai refused to kneel before Haman, he was enraged and wanted to take revenge. He was so angry that he wanted to take revenge not only on Mordecai, but on all people of Mordecai, that is, on all Jews. So Haman went to the king and told him, "King Ahasuerus," Haman stated, "there is a group of people in your kingdom with different laws from ours. They obey their laws, but do not keep the laws given by the king. Such people should not be allowed to live." "Your Majesty," Haman continued, "my advice is this: issue a decree to have these people destroyed, and in exchange I will give 10,000 talents of silver to the king's administrators for the royal treasury." The king had great confidence in Haman, so he took his royal ring off his finger and gave it to Haman. The ring had the king's seal, and for any law, edict, or command sealed with the king's ring, there was no turning back. Moreover, the king concluded, "Haman, I give you both silver and this people. Do with these people as you please." Haman wrote letters with the text of the edict in the name of King Ahasuerus to the rulers of every land across the kingdom. The letter contained the text of the new law, ordering all people to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jews in the land, young, old, children, and women, on the 13th day of the month of Adar, and then plunder their goods. Each letter was sealed with the royal ring. The horsemen of the palace hurried to deliver the letters containing the king's command, and to every land of the kingdom, and wherever they went, they announced the new law, urging all people to be ready to carry out the command and exterminate the Jews. The king's command was also announced in the capital of Susa. While the king and Haman were drinking and feasting in the palace, the city of Susa was bewildered. All the Jews were terrified by the king's order. They fasted, wept, and lay in sackcloth and ashes. It was custom in those days, when people were in great distress, that they would put on old clothes made of rough sackcloth and would weep and pray to God. Mordecai was terrified when hearing the king's command. He tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes and went into the city, wailing loudly and bitterly. But he went only as far as the king's gate, because no one clothed in sackcloth was allowed to enter it. Esther learned that Mordecai was at the gate and sent him changing clothes through her servants, but he refused to change out of the sackcloth. Then Esther had one of her servants, Hatak, ask Mordecai why he was behaving so unusually. Mordecai told Hatak everything that had happened. He told how Haman, in exchange for a large amount of money, demanded from the king the right to exterminate the Jews, and how the king agreed to Haman's request. He even sent Esther a copy of the king's command so that Queen Esther could see it. Mordecai also ordered Esther to go to the king and beg for mercy and insist that the king would save the Jewish people, for Esther herself was also Jewish. Hatak told Mordecai's words to Esther. The queen was also horrified to hear the news, and she sent the next message to Mordecai. "We all know that anyone who goes to the king without being called upon, whether male or female, may be killed on the spot," Esther's note read. It is only if the king holds out his golden scepter that a person coming into his presence may live. But I haven't seen the king for 30 days. The scepter was an ornament staff the king carried as a symbol of sovereignty and power. If the king held out a scepter to a person, it meant that the person was being welcomed by the king. But if the king did not hold out a scepter, the law said that the person was a threat and should be killed. It made sense then that Esther was afraid of what might happen if she went to the king uninvited. She knew her life was at stake. But on the other hand, she also knew that the lives of the entire Jewish people were at stake. Her people would be destroyed if she did nothing. What was Esther supposed to do in this situation? Mordecai sent the following message to Esther. Esther, do not imagine that you alone will somehow escape with your life out of all the Jews just because you're in the king's house. Mordecai told Queen Esther in his message, if you remain silent, help and deliverance may come from elsewhere for our people, but you and your family will surely perish. The message continued, who knows if it wasn't for such times as this that you have become queen? Then Esther answered and wrote Mordecai the following message. Gather all the Jews of Susa and fast for me. Queen Esther asked Mordecai, do not eat or drink anything for 3 days. My maids and I will fast with you. After these 3 days, I will appear before the king, even if he does not call me, and if I perish, I perish. Esther was aware that she would risk her life by going to the king without being called, but she also knew that it was no coincidence that God planned to put her as queen at a time like that. Mordecai left the palace gate and carried out all of the queen's instructions. The Jews fasted and prayed for 3 days that the king would invite Esther into his presence. Only God could save them. After 3 days of prayer and fasting, Esther put on her royal robes to appear before the king. Then she went into the inner courts of the palace where the king sat on his throne. Esther walked with tremendous fear and hope at the same time. Whatever was to come would change the lives of the Jews forever. There were 2 possibilities. The king could resent Esther for daring to come to him uninvited. And we have seen so far that King Ahasuerus was not at all a calm and understanding man. That would mean that Esther would end up like Vashti, the queen before her, and the Jews would all be killed. But there was also another possibility, that the king would welcome Esther in his presence and listen to her request. The king was sitting on his throne in the inner court of the palace. Esther opened the door with great fear, not knowing what was to come. Esther was facing the most difficult situation of all, but she knew God was asking her to do this. At the same time, she knew that if God sent her to the king to plead for the life of the Jewish people, God would also be the one to lead the way. Most of the time, listening and obeying is not easy. Obeying sometimes pushes us to do things we would not want to do. We know something is good, and yet we find it hard to obey. Other times we may not even understand why God or our parents are asking us to do certain things, but the Bible tells us that we must listen and obey to godly direction, even if we do not understand. The good news is that God never leaves us alone. If we listen to the Lord, He will help us cope with any situation. The same God who went with Esther will also be with you. Listen and obey to the Lord, and He will bless you. What will the king do when he sees Esther? Will he hold out his royal scepter to her and invite her in? Or will he drive her away as he did with Vashti, so that she will never appear before him again? Moreover, what will happen to the Jewish people? Will God deliver His people, or will they be destroyed by Haman's wicked plan? You will find out all this in our next episode when we get to see what God has chosen to do in the lives of Queen Esther and the entire Jewish people. Produced by David and Goliath Productions, you can re-watch this episode along with the rest of the series on YouTube on the DG Bible Stories channel. Also, you can find our DG Bible Stories series in audio format on most podcast apps. We also invite you to listen to the DG Bible Songs music. You can find it on YouTube, as well as on Spotify, Apple Music, and other streaming platforms.